There's a folder on my laptop that I open about once a week. It holds 11 photographs. I look at them in order, then I close the folder. I don't know what else to do with them. The photographs aren't mine. They came off an SD card pulled from a Reconyx trail camera mounted on a lodgepole pine, about 14 miles into the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho. The man who pulled the card is named Russell Vail. He's a wildlife biologist with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. 15 years on the job. He calibrates instruments for a living and writes his field notes in mechanical pencil because he doesn't trust ink in the rain. I've known Vail for about 8 years. We met through a mutual friend in Boise, and we've gone fishing maybe a dozen times together. He's not a storyteller. He's not the type to embellish. If anything, he's so careful it drives you crazy at a bar when you're trying to get a clean version of a normal thing he saw. Every claim has caveats. Every claim gets walked back by half a step. He'll tell you he saw a wolverine and then spend 10 minutes hedging that it might have been a fisher in the wrong light. So when he showed up at my house in March with a manila envelope and asked me to look at something, I knew it wasn't going to be a fish story. I'm going to walk you through what he showed me. I'll tell you what he did next. And then I'll tell you what happened the last time I saw him, which was about 3 weeks ago, and which I haven't been able to stop thinking about since. You decide what you make of it. Vail's job, the part of it that matters here, was running a long-term wildlife monitoring grid in the Frank Church. If you don't know that area, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness is the largest contiguous wilderness in the lower 48. About 2.25 million acres. No roads, no motorized vehicles. You go in on foot or on horseback, or you don't go in. The interior is some of the most remote terrain in the country. Plenty of it hasn't been walked over by a human being in decades. The grid was a network of 46 trail cameras placed at predetermined coordinates across the wilderness, deployed in 2020 as part of a multi-year carnivore study. Wolves, mountain lions, bears, wolverine if they got lucky. Vail wasn't the only biologist on the project, but he had a section of about 12 cameras that were his to maintain. He pulled the cards every 6 to 8 weeks during the field season, swapped batteries, checked the mounts, and brought the cards back to a field office in Salmon, Idaho, where the footage got logged and tagged. Boring stuff, mostly. Most of what's on a trail camera in central Idaho is nothing. Wind moving a branch, a leaf falling through the IR beam, the same elk herd at the same crossing twice a week. Sometimes you get a bear. Once Vail pulled a card and got 2 minutes of a mountain lion eating a deer carcass, which he said was the most exciting thing he'd seen on a card in 3 years. The camera I'm going to tell you about was at a site Vail called Echo 7. He always used the project's grid designations rather than place names because the place names didn't really fit anymore once you started thinking about them as data points. Echo 7 was on a north-facing slope above a small drainage that fed into Big Creek. The drainage didn't have an official name. The camera was on a lodgepole pine about 4 feet off the ground, angled to cover a game trail that ran along the contour. It had been there since June of 2020. Before I get into the photographs, I want to make sure something is clear, because it matters. These cameras don't take video, they take stills. They trigger on motion and infrared, and they fire a burst of 3 to 5 photographs per trigger event, then go into a cooldown for about 30 seconds before they can fire again. The timestamps are stamped on each photograph by the camera itself. Date, time, temperature, moon phase. The metadata is on the file. You can't fake that without specialized software, and even then, an experienced biologist would spot it. What this means is that the photographs Vail showed me weren't part of some continuous video sequence where you could question the editing. Each one was an independent trigger event. Each one had its own timestamp. They were time-stamped by a machine in the woods that nobody was watching. The first card pull I'm going to describe was on October 14th, 2022. Vail had hiked in from a trailhead near Big Creek with a field assistant named Pete Driscoll, who has since left the agency and who I'm not going to be saying much about because he asked me not to. They camped about a mile from Echo 7 and went up to the camera in the morning. Standard procedure. Vail pulled the card, slotted a fresh one, checked the housing, hiked out the same day. He didn't review the card until he got back to Salmon. The protocol was to log the footage in the field office, with the project's software open, and to make notes on anything interesting. He sat down at his desk, plugged the card into the reader, and started clicking through. About 40 minutes in, he saw the first one. Now picture this because it matters for understanding what looking at a trail camera card is actually like. You're not watching a movie. You're clicking through still images one at a time, usually a few hundred per card, and most of them are empty. Wind moving a branch, a leaf falling through the IR beam, the same patch of forest over and over, with a timestamp ticking forward. Vale had developed a habit, like anyone who does this work, of clicking through fast. His eyes were trained to catch movement, shape, anything that broke the pattern. He could go through a card of 200 photographs in 20 minutes if it was a quiet site. Echo 7 had not been quiet. There were elk, 2 coyote sequences, a brief, half-frame appearance of a black bear that he marked for follow-up. By the time he got to the photograph that stopped him, he'd been clicking through for almost an hour and was thinking about lunch. He told me the moment he saw it, he didn't immediately think anything was wrong. He thought the camera had captured a hiker, which would have been unusual because Echo 7 wasn't on a trail, but it wasn't impossible. People go off trail in the Frank Church, hunters mostly. The fall season was active. The figure was at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by the trunk of a Douglas fir. About 30 yards from the camera, give or take, standing upright, tall. Vale's first read was that it was a tall man, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing dark clothing, but something about the proportions bothered him. He told me later that the bother wasn't conscious yet. It was just a low-level itch. He moved on, clicked to the next photograph. The next one in the sequence, 4 seconds later, showed the figure in a slightly different position, still partially behind the fur. The angle of the head had changed. It was looking more toward the camera. The third in the burst, 8 seconds after the first, showed the figure stepping out from behind the tree. Vale stopped clicking. He sat at his desk and looked at the screen for what he later estimated was about 2 minutes. Driscoll was at the next desk over, doing his own card work, and asked Vale what was up. Vale didn't answer right away. He was trying to figure out what he was actually looking at. The thing in the photograph wasn't a man. The proportions were wrong in ways he could now see. The arms were too long. They hung past the knees. The shoulders were too wide and sloped in a way that didn't match a human skeleton. The head was wrong, the neck angle, the way the chest sat above the hips. It was upright, it was bipedal, but it wasn't built like a person. And here's the part he kept coming back to when he was telling me about it. The face was wrong. The face. He kept saying that word. Vale couldn't see the face clearly. It was still in shadow from the canopy, and the IR was washing out the detail, but the shape of it. The way it tapered forward into a snout. The way the jaw sat. He told me he'd looked at thousands of black bear photographs over his career, and he knew what a bear's head looked like, and he knew what a bear's posture looked like, and this thing was neither. He called Driscoll over. Driscoll looked at the screen for about 30 seconds and asked what the hell that was. Vale didn't have an answer. He moved to the next photograph in the burst. The thing had taken a step forward. It was now fully clear of the fur, both arms hanging at its sides, its head still tilted toward the camera. The timestamp showed 12 seconds had elapsed since the first frame. Then, the burst ended. The next trigger event was 48 minutes later. A snowshoe hare crossing the frame at dawn. Vale and Driscoll sat at the desk for a long time, going back through the 4 photographs. Driscoll wanted to call it a tall hiker, even though both of them could see it wasn't. He kept saying the camera angle was throwing them off. He kept saying the IR was distorting the proportions. Vale let him say all of that and then asked him to look at the hands. The hands hung past the knees, in all 4 photographs. You could see them clearly in the last one. They were too long. The fingers were too long. The proportion of forearm to upper arm was wrong. Vale flagged the sequence in the database. He didn't write anything in the notes column. He just attached a flag and moved on. He had 11 more cards to log that week. He went home that night and couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the last frame. The figure stepped clear of the tree, the proportions, the fingers. Around 2 in the morning, he got up, drove back to the field office, and let himself in. He pulled up the database and started going backward through Echo 7's archive. Every card pull from that camera since June 2020. He had 19 card pulls worth of footage to go through. He sat at his desk in the dark with just the monitor on and went through every photograph one by one. He found another one at 4:30 in the morning. August 2022, 8 weeks before the October pull. Same camera, same angle, same drainage. The figure was in 2 frames at the very far edge of the camera's field of view, maybe 60 yards out, half obscured by a stand of small pines on a rise, standing upright. Looking, if you can call it that, in the direction of the camera, Vale almost missed it. The figure was so far away that on a fast scroll it would have blended into the trees. He only caught it because by then he was looking for it. He pulled the burst sequence open. 3 frames, the figure didn't move between them. It just stood there at 60 yards, looking. The August timestamp said 5:18 a.m. and the temperature was 41 degrees. He kept going. He found another one in June 2022. The figure was even farther back, almost on the ridge above the drainage. He had to zoom in to be sure. He measured the height against the trees and the contour lines. And he ran his math the way a biologist runs math, and he got about 90 yards from the camera, 2 frames, standing, watching. He found another in March 2022, around 110 yards, just the head visible above a deadfall. He found another in November 2021, around 130 yards. He almost couldn't see it. He had to enhance the image. There was something tall and dark standing among the trees on the ridge. He sat at his desk and looked at the screen. He had 4 card pulls worth of evidence in front of him, going back almost a year. The figure had been at Echo 7 since at least November 2021, probably earlier. He hadn't checked yet. But the pattern was already clear. The figure was getting closer in every card pull, not just closer over the year, closer in every individual pull. November 2021, 130 yards. March 2022, 110. June 2022, 90. August 2022, 60. October 2022, 30. And in each pull, the figure appeared in roughly the same kind of sequence. A burst of 2 to 4 frames, almost always around dawn, or just after, almost always with the figure standing still and looking toward the camera, never moving in or out of the frame in any normal way. Just there. Then gone for weeks. Then there again, closer. Vale sat in the dark in the field office in Salmon, Idaho, at 5 in the morning in October 2022, and he understood that something had been walking up to his camera for a year. He didn't have a word for what. He just knew the pattern was deliberate. He went home and slept for 3 hours. Then he came back to the office and went through the rest of the Echo 7 archive. He found 2 more sightings, both earlier than November 2021. June 2021 at about 170 yards. October 2020 at about 200 yards. Just inside the camera's far range, almost lost in the trees on the ridge. The earliest one was from October 2020. The camera had been deployed in June 2020. The figure had appeared the first fall after the camera went up. Maybe right after. Maybe the camera was the thing that brought it. The 11 photographs in my folder are those 11 sightings, arranged in chronological order. You can watch the figure walk in. Vale took the data to his supervisor, a woman named Marlene Ash, 2 days later. He had it all laid out. Spreadsheet of timestamps. Distance estimates with the methodology shown. Reference photographs of known bears and known elk at the same camera for comparison. He'd put together what he called, very carefully, an unidentified bipedal signature. Ash sat at her desk and looked through the file for about 10 minutes. Then she closed the folder and asked Vale to close the door. What she told him, Vale repeated to me almost word for word. He has a good memory for conversations he doesn't want to forget. She told him he was a careful biologist, and she respected his work. She told him she could see what was in the photographs. She wasn't going to tell him he was imagining it. And then she told him that if he wrote this up officially, his career was over. Not because anyone would fire him, because the moment a wildlife biologist with the state of Idaho put his name on a document that even glanced sideways at the suggestion of a tall, bipedal, unidentified creature in the Frank Church, every paper he'd ever publish for the rest of his life would have an asterisk next to it. Every grant application would die in committee. Every colleague would remember. She told him to flag the camera as malfunctioning. She told him to swap out the unit at the next service window. She told him to file the photographs as IR artifacts in the secondary archive where nobody would look at them. And she told him never to bring this up to her again. Vale asked her if she'd ever seen anything like this before. She didn't answer for a while. Then she said that in 15 years of running monitoring grids in the Salmon Chalice National Forest, she'd seen 2 cards that she'd filed as malfunctions that hadn't been malfunctions. She wouldn't tell him what was on them. She told him there's a category of data the agency calls anomalous biological signature that doesn't appear in any public-facing report and never will. She told him, welcome to it. Vale sat across from her and waited. He told me later he'd been ready to push, ready to ask which cameras, which dates, which drainages. He'd watched her face while he sat there, and he'd decided not to. There was something in her expression he didn't want to be responsible for cracking. He'd worked with Ash for almost a decade. He'd seen her stand in waist-deep water in February to pull a salmon weir clear of ice. He'd seen her fire a state senator's nephew from a field crew for falsifying transect data. She wasn't a person who scared easily. The face she had on while she sat in her office and told him about the category was a face he'd never seen on her before. She did tell him one thing. She told him the anomalous category had originated in the 1970s, when the agency had started getting trail camera data that didn't fit anything in the wildlife taxonomy. The category wasn't officially titled. It existed as a tag in a closed database. The tag had been applied, across the western states, to somewhere between 40 and 90 records over the past 50 years, depending on which agencies you counted. She didn't know the exact number because she didn't have access to the full database. Only certain supervisors did, and they got access through a process Ash described as being introduced to it by someone who'd been introduced to it. Nobody had ever published anything about the category. Nobody ever would. The records were kept because the agency's institutional culture didn't allow for throwing away primary data, even data nobody was going to look at. The records were never reviewed because looking at them too closely was, in Ash's phrasing, career irreversible. She told him the people who knew about the category had two informal rules they followed. The first rule was that you didn't talk about it with anyone outside the supervisor channel. The second rule was that you didn't go back to whatever site had produced the record, ever. Not to retrieve the camera, not to confirm the sighting, not to satisfy your own curiosity. You replaced the camera at a different site, and you let the original location go feral. The reasoning behind the second rule, she told him, was not theoretical. It was based on what had happened to the small number of biologists who had broken it. She didn't say what had happened to them. She told him that information was available through the same channels as the database tag, and that if he wanted access to it, he could request it through her, but that she would not recommend doing so. She told him that the biologists in question were no longer with the agency. She told him the agency's HR records described their departures as voluntary. She told him she had attended 2 of their funerals. Then she told him, again, to file the photographs as artifacts and to stop thinking about Echo 7. He left her office and drove home and sat in his truck in the driveway for an hour before he went inside. He didn't file the photographs as artifacts. He kept the original card. He copied the 11 sightings to his personal hard drive, and to a backup drive, and to a thumb drive he kept in his glove compartment. He told Driscoll to forget what he'd seen. Driscoll, by then, was already trying to forget it on his own. Vale kept going to work. He kept maintaining the grid. He kept his head down. But Echo 7 was due for another card pull in December, and he started planning for it the day he got home from Ash's office. He wasn't going to swap the camera. He was going to go in alone and pull the card himself. December in the Frank Church is not a friendly place. By mid-month, you have snowpack at elevation, temperatures well below freezing at night, and short daylight windows. The trailhead Vale had used in October was closed by snow. He had to access the area from a different direction, through Big Creek Road, as far as the road would take him. Then, about 9 miles in, on snowshoes through country he didn't know well. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He told his wife he had a maintenance trip for work. He told Ash nothing. He went on a Saturday in mid-December, planning to be in and out in 3 days. He told me later that the hike in was the worst part of the whole thing. Not the cold, although the cold was bad. The silence. December in those mountains, with the snow muffling everything and no wind for the first day and a half, was the quietest place he'd ever been in his life. He said he could hear his own pulse. He started talking to himself just to break it. And then he stopped, because hearing his own voice in that silence was worse than the silence. He got to Echo 7 on the afternoon of the second day. The light was already going. He had maybe an hour before he'd need to set up camp. The first thing he noticed was that the camera was angled wrong. He'd mounted it in June 2020 with the lens parallel to the slope, aimed across the game trail at a height of about 4 feet. He'd checked the angle on every service visit. It had not moved. It was a heavy unit, bolted to the tree through a steel mount. It didn't move on its own. When he came up to it in December 2022, the camera was tilted about 15 degrees to the right, aimed off the trail, into the trees, aimed at a spot about 40 yards uphill from where it had been pointing for 2.5 years. Vale stood in the snow and looked at the camera and then looked in the direction it was aimed. The forest in that direction was just forest. Lodgepole pine and spruce and some young Douglas fir. Nothing was there, but the camera was looking at it. He took photographs of the camera before he touched it, with his own phone, with a backup point and shoot, and on his small Canon DSLR. He documented the angle, the mount, the snow patterns around the base of the tree. He wrote down the time and the temperature and the wind. He did everything by the book, because if he wrote it up later, he wanted his documentation to be unimpeachable. Then he pulled the card. The replacement card he was carrying went into the slot. He left the camera angled the way he found it. He didn't correct it. He didn't want to know if whatever had moved it would notice if he moved it back. He hiked back to where he was going to camp, about half a mile from Echo 7, in a small bowl below the ridge, with a stream running through it. He'd picked the site on a topo map before he left. It was sheltered, and it had water, and it was, he thought, far enough from the camera site to not be on whatever path the thing was using. He set up his tent. He cooked dinner, He sat in his tent and pulled out a small laptop with extra batteries and a card reader, and he plugged in the card he'd just pulled. The card had 3 sightings on it. Late October, 20 yards, 2 frames. The figure was standing on the game trail, not behind any trees, fully clear, fully visible. The proportions were unambiguous now. 7 feet tall. The arms hung past the knees. The hands were elongated. The head tapered forward. The face still in shadow because the burst had triggered at dawn and the IR couldn't quite make the features come through. But the shape of it, the shape of the head was like nothing Vale had ever seen on a living animal. Mid-November, 12 yards, 1 frame, just 1. The camera had triggered once and then the next trigger event was 4 days later and was a snowshoe hare. The figure was standing in the middle of the trail, looking directly into the lens. The arms were still at the sides. The body was tilted very slightly forward at the hips, the way a runner might lean before starting. Late November, 6 feet from the camera. That's the photograph that, when Vale showed me the manila envelope in March, was on top of the stack. The one he wanted me to see first. The face is in the frame. The whole face, not in shadow. The IR hits it directly because the figure is so close to the camera that it triggers the floodlight at full intensity. I'm going to describe what's in that photograph because I have to. And I want you to understand that I'm not embellishing. I'm describing the photograph sitting in a folder on my laptop right now. The face is canine, but it isn't a wolf or a dog. The snout is longer in proportion to the skull than any canid I've seen reference photos of. The eyes are forward set, predator eyes, but the orbits are deep and the eyes themselves reflect the IR with a metallic gleam that doesn't look like the standard tapetum lucidum shine of normal mammals. The ears are set wider apart than a wolf's, and they're forward, attentive. The mouth is closed, you can't see the teeth. But it's not the face that I look at when I open the folder. It's the body. The face almost distracts you from the body. The head sits on top of a neck that's too long and too vertical. The shoulders below the neck are broad and human proportioned, sloped down into a torso that's narrow at the waist and wide at the chest. The arms are long and ape-like. The hands, visible in the frame, have 5 fingers, and the fingers are extremely long, and they end in what look like nails rather than claws. The legs below the hips are digitigrade. They bend backward at the knees, the way a dog's hind legs bend. It is bipedal, and it is furred, and it has a canine head, and human shoulders, and digitigrade legs, and an upright posture. And it is standing 6 feet from a Reconyx trail camera in a wilderness in central Idaho. And it is looking directly into the lens with what every person I have shown the photograph to has independently described as deliberate interest. That's the photograph Vale showed me in March. That's the one I can't stop looking at. The other 10 in the folder are the build-up. The November late one is the arrival. He didn't sleep that night in the tent. He sat up with the laptop dimmed almost to black and the photograph on the screen, and he listened. He told me he didn't hear anything that whole night. No animals, no wind. He said it was the loudest silence he'd ever sat in. In the morning, he hiked out. The hike out took 2 days. He did it in 1.5. By the time he got to his truck on the evening of the 3rd day, his face was windburned and his right knee was swollen, and he hadn't eaten anything but trail mix for 14 hours. He drove home, he showered, he sat in his kitchen. He didn't go back to work for 3 days. He called in sick. He didn't tell his wife what he'd seen on the card. He sat in his kitchen and looked out the window at the small grove of aspens behind his property. And he thought about what he was supposed to do now. Ash had told him to file it as a malfunction. Ash had told him the agency had a category for this. He believed her. He'd looked over the previous month for any official record of what she was describing. He couldn't find anything, which meant whatever category it was a category that didn't appear in any database he had access to. He started looking outside the agency, quietly, from his personal computer on a coffee shop Wi-Fi, the way you look at things when you don't want a paper trail. He looked at cryptid forums, which he found embarrassing. He looked at academic papers, which he found unhelpful. He looked at old Forest Service incident reports, which were paywalled or sealed. He looked at indigenous oral traditions from the region, which were respectful and elliptical and gave him a lot to think about, but no clean answers. He kept coming back to a specific category of accounts. They were scattered across decades and across countries, but they shared structural features: a camera in a remote location, a figure visible at the edge of the frame, the figure getting closer in subsequent images, the same canid bipedal silhouette, the same sense of deliberate approach. He showed me a list of them when he came to my house in March. Some he'd confirmed independently. Some he couldn't verify, but the descriptions matched. He was building a pattern. He wasn't sure what the pattern meant yet. He named some of them for me, cases I'd heard of and cases I hadn't. There was a Forest Service archive from the Coronado National Forest in southern Arizona, 1973, where a fire spotter had taken a series of Polaroid photographs over the course of a season, showing what she called the tall walker, approaching her cabin from the saguaro, stands at increasing proximity week by week until, on the last photograph, the figure was at her porch railing and the photograph itself was the last frame she ever shot from that lookout. The fire spotter requested reassignment the following Monday. The photographs were filed by the supervising ranger as malfunctioned exposures and were destroyed in a cabinet purge in 1991. 3 former employees of the regional office had attested separately to having seen them. One of those former employees was still alive when Vale tracked her down through a retiree association. She'd talked to him for 40 minutes on the phone. She'd told him the spotter's name had been Adela Munoz, that Munoz had spoken Spanish at home and had used the word duende when she'd described the figure to colleagues, and that Munoz had died in 1984 of what the death certificate called natural causes, but what the retiree who had known her described as a slow refusal to be in any enclosed space at night. Munoz had slept on her porch from 1973 onward, even in winter, even when she moved to Tucson and lived in a house with locks on the doors. The retiree said Munoz had told her once that the figure had come into her cabin on the last night, before the last Polaroid, and had stood at the foot of her cot, and had not done anything. Just stood. For most of the night, and in the morning, when light came through the window, it had been gone, and she had taken the Polaroid from the porch as it walked back into the saguaros, and she had walked off the lookout that afternoon. There was a logging camp in northern Saskatchewan, 1958, where the crew foreman had kept a journal documenting what he called the Watcher of the Cuts, appearing at the edge of clear-cut sections at decreasing distances over a 6-month period. The journal had been donated to a provincial archive by the foreman's grandson. Vale had ordered a copy of the digitization. The entries were laconic and progressively more frightened. The foreman was a Scotsman named Angus Reid, who'd spent 30 years in the boreal forest, and who'd previously kept journals that were almost entirely concerned with weather and equipment. The 1958 journal started normally and stayed normal through May. The first mention of the Watcher came in late June and was a single line. Tall fellow at the north edge of the cut, did not approach when called, likely a trapper. By August, Reid had written the Watcher into the journal 43 times. By September, he'd stopped using the word Watcher and was just calling it him. He'd started carrying a rifle on his shoulder when he walked between camp and the cut, which the journal noted was the first time he'd done so in 20 years. The final entry in late October said, "He is at the road now. The men have seen him. We are stopping work on this contract." The contract was canceled. The camp was abandoned. The trees in that cut block, Vale discovered through aerial photography records, were never harvested and are still standing today. 140 acres of unbroken old-growth white spruce surrounded on every side by second growth from the 1960s logging that resumed in the area after Reid's crew left. There was a wildlife management area in northern Wisconsin 2008 where a deer hunter had set up a trail camera and pulled the card a month later and seen something in 3 of the frames that he wouldn't describe to the local newspaper that covered it, except to say that the figure had gotten closer in each subsequent frame and that the last frame showed the camera being touched. The hunter had moved out of state within a year. Vale had reached out to him through a Wisconsin deer hunting forum where the hunter had posted under his real name. The hunter, whose name was Brian Kellerman, had agreed to talk on the phone for about 10 minutes. He'd told Vale that the frame showing the camera being touched had also shown the figure's face, and that he had deleted the file from his card and from his computer and from his backup drive within 48 hours of seeing it. He'd told Vale he wished he hadn't deleted it. He'd told Vale he also understood that he would have deleted it again if he had it to do over. He'd asked Vale not to call back, and there was one Vale had found in a Maine state archive from 1971. Where a remote weather station maintained by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the deep woods west of Moosehead Lake had recorded on its automated 16mm cloud camera a sequence of frames across 9 months showing what the technician who reviewed the film had described in his handwritten incident report as a tall figure of indeterminate species approaching the station from the southwest at irregular intervals. The technician had attached a thumbnail enlargement of one frame to his report. The thumbnail had been removed from the file by the time Vale requested the documents. The textual report was still there. The technician had concluded his report with a sentence that Vale had read out loud to me in my kitchen, because he said it was the cleanest expression of the thing he'd been trying to put words to since October. The sentence was, It is the considered judgment of this observer that the subject was aware of being filmed and was, throughout the period of observation, performing for the camera. The pattern was the same across all of them: a camera or an observer at a fixed point, a figure at the edge of the visible distance, repeated appearances, closing distance, eventual proximity so close it produced what the people involved described as a transmission of attention rather than just a sighting. And then, almost always, the observer left, moved, quit, asked for reassignment, stopped going to that spot. Vale had spent 2 months building this list. He'd done it on his own time. He'd cross-referenced cases through public records and through one specific online forum that he wouldn't name to me because he said he didn't want to send me there. That was when he asked me for help, because by then he'd started reading some other things, and he wanted somebody who wasn't a biologist to look at it with him. He wanted somebody who could think about the question outside the frame of natural science. He wanted somebody who'd read a lot of weird books. I have read a lot of weird books. I told him I'd look at whatever he had. He pulled an old paperback out of the envelope after he showed me the photographs. The cover was beat up. The corners were dog-eared. He'd been reading it on the long drive in from Salmon. It was a translation of a book that's not in the Standard Bible. It hasn't been in the Standard Bible for about 1,500 years, depending on which tradition you ask. But it was in the older Bibles. It's still considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Dead Sea Scrolls had 10 copies of it. The New Testament book of Jude quotes from it directly. It's called the Book of Enoch. Vale handed it to me and asked me to read chapters 6 through 16. He said to tell him if I saw what he saw. I'd read parts of Enoch before, years ago, in the context of a comparative religion class I'd half paid attention to. I knew the broad shape of it: the Watchers, the Nephilim, Mount Hermon, the Flood. I didn't remember the specifics. Vale asked me to read it then, right there at the table. He waited while I did. For people who haven't encountered it, the Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish apocalyptic text that probably reached its final form sometime in the 1st or 2nd century BCE. It claims to be written by Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, who, in the canonical Bible, famously walked with God and was taken up without dying. The Enoch literature expands on that figure in significant ways. It gives him tours of heaven, it gives him a cosmological vision, and it tells, in detail, a story that canonical Genesis covers in just 4 verses. The story is this: there were 200 angels, called Watchers, whose job was to observe and oversee the development of humanity. At some point in the deep past, these Watchers chose to leave their assigned positions and descend to the earth. They came down on Mount Hermon, which is a real mountain on the border of modern Syria and Lebanon. They took human women as wives, and they fathered children with them. The children were not normal children, they were giants. The text calls them the Nephilim. Some translations render the word as fallen ones, others as those who cause others to fall. The Watchers also taught humanity things they were not supposed to know. Azazel taught the working of metals into weapons. Shemyaza and the others taught enchantments and astrology and the cutting of roots. The world filled up with violence and corruption, and the Nephilim, the giant offspring, were predatory. They ate everything. When the food ran out, the text says, they began to eat each other and to eat people. God's response was the flood. The Watchers were chained beneath the earth in pits of darkness until the day of judgment. The Nephilim, being half spirit and half flesh, were killed in the flood. But here's the part that Vale handed me the book to read. Their spirits did not die. The Book of Enoch, chapter 15, verses 8 through 11, gives a specific theological account of what happened to the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim after the flood. I'm going to quote it loosely because the translations vary. It says in essence that because the Nephilim were born from spirit and flesh, their spirits could not enter heaven when their bodies died. They became evil spirits on the earth. The text calls them by various names in various translations: earth spirits, hill spirits, spirits that dwell in the wild places. The text says they will afflict the children of men until the day of judgment. It says they will dwell in wastelands and in deserts and in the mountains. It says they take many forms. Vale asked me to read out loud from the section he'd marked, so I did. Chapter 15. And now, the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the holy Watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. I read the next part. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling. But the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth, on the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men, and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. I stopped reading. The kitchen was quiet for a while. I'd read those verses before. I'd read them as mythology, as metaphor for the violence of the late Bronze Age, or as a moral allegory about hubris, or as a literary curiosity that had fallen out of the canon for reasons that were mostly political. I had never read them as a field description. Sitting at my kitchen table with 11 trail camera photographs spread out next to the paperback, I read them as a field description: the hunger that produced no food, the dwelling in wild places, the taking of many forms. None of it sounded like metaphor anymore. It sounded like somebody 2,000 years ago trying to describe the same thing Vale had been trying to describe, and reaching for the same words a person reaches for when they're trying to name something they can see clearly and don't understand at all. Vale watched me read. When I looked up, he asked me if I noticed anything. I told him I noticed that the text described forest spirits in wild places, in non-human forms, that had been there since before recorded history. I told him I noticed that wasn't proof of anything. He nodded, agreed it wasn't proof. He said he wasn't trying to prove anything. He just wanted me to notice the structural fit. He told me the part he kept coming back to wasn't the description of the spirits as predatory. It was the phrasing about hunger and thirst that produced no food. He said it sounded to him like a description of a need without an object, a hunger that wasn't for meat, a pull toward us that wasn't because we were prey. That was what he kept feeling when he looked at his photographs. The thing in the frame wasn't hunting him. It was reaching for something it couldn't quite get. Then he showed me something else. He had a printout in the envelope, a list of cryptid reports from the past 120 years, Sasquatch sightings, dogman sightings, skinwalker accounts, Wendigo accounts, reports from the Pine Barrens and the Adirondacks and the Cascades and the Rockies. He'd filtered the list. He'd kept only the reports that came from remote forested areas, that described upright bipedal figures with non-human features, and that included details about the figure being seen at progressively closer distances over time. His filter cut the global cryptid record down to about 60 cases. Of those 60, 41 described the creature as having a canine head, long snout, forward-set ears, pointed teeth when teeth were visible. The remaining 19 described things that weren't canine but were close, wolfish, ursine but stretched. One described a dog standing up wrong. He told me he wasn't trying to claim the Book of Enoch was literally true. He wasn't a religious man. He wasn't trying to claim the cryptid reports were literally true either. He was, he said, an empiricist. He looked at data, and the data was telling him that across 40 centuries of human history, including a text from the 2nd century BCE and a Reconyx trail camera from 2022, there was a recurring pattern. A canine-headed bipedal figure that appeared in wild places, that approached human settlements and human equipment, and that had been seen, described, and feared by every culture that had spent significant time in deep forest. He wanted to know what the pattern meant. I told him I didn't know. We sat at the table for a long time. He finished his coffee, he looked out the window. Eventually he told me he didn't think the thing in his photographs was a Nephilim. He didn't think it was a dogman either, although he understood why people called them that. He thought it was something for which the cultures that had encountered it had reached for the closest word they had, and it ended up with different words depending on what language they spoke. He thought there was a thing in the forests that was older than the people who had been trying to describe it for as long as people had been there. He thought it was patient. He thought the patience was the worst part. He said an animal that moves on a 1-year time scale and walks up to a camera over the course of 17 months is not an animal. It's something else. He told me he was going to go back. I told him not to. I didn't see Vale in person between March and April. We exchanged emails, not many. He sent me photographs of pages from books, a long passage from a translation of the Watchers fragment in 4Q1, a scan of a map from a 1932 Forest Service survey of the Bitterroot Range that had certain drainages marked with a small red dot in the corner of the cartography, with no key explaining what the red dots meant. He'd been trying to find the original surveyor's notes. He'd written to the National Archives twice. The first response was a polite redirect. The second response was no response at all. He called me twice in that month. The first call was on a Wednesday at around 11 at night. He'd been drinking, not a lot, but enough that he was being more direct than I was used to from him. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about the camera being moved, about the locking pin, about the fact that the thing had the manual dexterity to undo a bracket and the patience to walk a piece of steel 40 yards downhill into the center of a circle made of stones. He said the patience was the thing he kept coming back to. He understood that the patience was a kind of intelligence we don't have an analog for. We work on quarters and fiscal years. The thing was working on its own time scale, and the 17 months he'd been able to document was probably the tail end of something that had been going for much longer. The second call was on a Friday morning. He told me he'd decided to go back. He didn't ask my opinion. He told me the way you tell someone something so they can't say later that they didn't know. He gave me the trailhead he was using. He gave me the date he was leaving and the date he expected to be out. He told me if he wasn't out by the Wednesday after, to call the agency and tell them where he was. I asked him why he was going back. He said he wanted to see the clearing. He wanted to confirm it was real. He'd been having dreams about it for 3 months, and the dreams had a clarity that he didn't trust. And the only way to make the dream stop was to go and confirm whether the place existed or not. I told him the photographs already proved the figure existed. He told me he wasn't going back for the figure. He was going back for the clearing. I asked him what the difference was. He said the figure was just a body. The clearing was a thought. I didn't know what to say to that. He called me back 90 minutes later and said he was going to take a satellite messenger. He said he'd check in every 24 hours. He said if I didn't hear from him for 48, I should call the agency. I asked him if he was scared. He said yes. Said being scared was the reason he had to go. He went anyway. The trip he made in late April was different from the December one. He didn't tell me he was going. He told his wife it was a work trip. He drove out to Big Creek on a Friday afternoon, hiked in over the weekend, and didn't come out until the following Wednesday. I didn't know any of this until afterward. He texted me on the Thursday after he got back. The text said, "I need to come see you." He drove down to Boise the next morning. What I'm about to tell you is what he told me in my kitchen on that Friday. He talked for about 3 hours straight. He drank 4 cups of coffee. He didn't take notes, and I didn't take notes either, because the whole thing had a quality where notes would have felt wrong. I've reconstructed it from memory, and from the things he sent me afterward. He hiked back to Echo 7 over 2 days, slower than December because the snow was rotten in patches and there was a lot of bushwhacking around blowdowns. The forest in April was a different animal than the forest in November. Robin's back, the creeks running hard with snowmelt, loud enough that you couldn't have heard somebody coming up behind you if they'd wanted you to. He stopped at a stream on the second morning and stood for a long time before crossing. He told me later he'd considered turning around. He'd looked back the way he'd come and waited. Then he'd put his boot in the water and crossed because he didn't have a better answer for himself than going to look. The whole second day he walked with a feeling that he described to me as being aimed, like he was around in a barrel and somebody had been pointing the barrel at this clearing for a while. He got to the camera on a Sunday afternoon. The camera was on the ground, not damaged, just sitting at the base of the tree on top of the snow, with the lens pointed up at the sky. The steel mount was still bolted to the tree. The bracket that held the camera to the mount was undone. The release tab was on the side of the unit, and it took, by Vale's estimate, about 90 seconds of deliberate manipulation by a thinking creature to undo. It was not something a bear would have figured out. It was not something a curious raccoon would have managed. The camera had been removed from its mount, set on the ground, and pointed at the sky. It was still recording. Vale picked it up. He took photographs of where it had been sitting, of the mount, of the snow around the tree. He pulled the card. He hiked uphill from the camera in the direction the camera had been angled in December. He used the GPS coordinates he had estimated. About 40 yards uphill, in a small clearing he hadn't noticed in any of his previous visits, he found something he couldn't immediately place. It was an arrangement on the ground. He described it carefully, about 12 feet across, in a rough circle. The center of the circle had been cleared of snow down to the bare ground. The ground itself had been turned, not dug. Turned the way you'd turn soil with a hand. The earth was warm to the touch. He pressed his palm flat against it and felt the warmth. He estimated it was at least 15 degrees above ambient. Around the cleared circle, arranged in even spacing, were objects. Stones, each one about the size of a softball, each one positioned with care. He counted them. There were 12. They formed a ring around the warm patch of ground. In the very center of the cleared ground, pressed flat into the warm earth, was a single piece of his trail camera mount, the locking pin. About 4 inches long, threaded steel. It had been removed from the bracket up the hill. Whatever had taken the camera off the tree had removed the pin and brought it down here and placed it in the middle of this arrangement. Vale stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. He didn't go into the circle. He told me he didn't go in for two reasons. The first was that he was a biologist, and disturbing a sight is not a thing biologists do until they've documented it. The second was that he understood, in a way he couldn't fully explain, that the circle was not for him. The circle had been left out for him to see, but going into it would have been a different thing entirely. He took photographs from the edge. He measured the diameter with a stretched-out trekking pole. He noted the GPS coordinates. He noted the temperature of the ground. He noted the spacing of the stones, which he estimated at 36 inches each, with a variation of less than half an inch between any two adjacent stones. Then he stepped back. The smell came in then. He told me he'd been smelling something faint since he reached the camera, and he'd put it out of his mind because his face was cold and his nose wasn't working right. But standing at the edge of the clearing, the smell sharpened. He said it was musk, heavy musk, the way a wet dog smells, but layered with something else. Something almost vegetal, like crushed pine needles, and something underneath them that he couldn't name. He said the smell made the back of his throat itch. The light was already going. He had maybe an hour. He'd planned to camp at the same bowl he'd used in December. He didn't want to camp there anymore. He wanted to be further away. He turned around to start hiking down. That's when he saw it. It was about 60 yards uphill from the clearing, standing among the trees, not moving, just standing, watching him. It was the same figure from the photographs, same proportions, same posture, same canine head. Even at 60 yards in failing light, he could see the silhouette clearly, the arms hanging past the knees, the shoulders sloped, the head tilted. He told me later that he was less afraid than he'd expected to be. He thought he'd be terrified. He'd been preparing himself for the possibility of seeing it. He'd run through it in his head 100 times. What he actually felt, he said, was a kind of stillness. He understood, looking at it, that it had been waiting for him. He stood at the edge of the clearing, and the figure stood among the trees, and neither of them moved for a long time. He didn't know how long. He estimated later it was maybe 4 minutes, long enough for the light to drop another notch, long enough for him to register the smell shifting, the musk getting heavier. He told me later that the 4 minutes were the longest 4 minutes of his life, and also the shortest, depending on which moment in them he was thinking about. There were stretches inside the 4 minutes where his sense of time went almost entirely still. He'd looked at the figure, and the figure had looked at him, and the snow had gone on, dropping in small increments off the canopy, and the world had reduced down to the line between his eyes and its eyes. He told me he could feel his heart in his chest in a way he hadn't felt since he was a kid. Not racing, slow, heavy, each beat distinct. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips inside his gloves. He could feel it at the base of his throat. He told me he understood, while it was happening, that his body was doing what bodies do when they realize that running is not going to be useful, and fighting is not going to be useful, and the only option is to stand still and see what happens. He kept looking for things he could read in the figure's posture. He'd spent his career reading the postures of animals. He could tell you from 40 yards out whether an elk was about to flee or just curious, whether a bear was annoyed or relaxed, whether a coyote had seen you yet or was working downwind on something else. The figure's posture didn't fit any of those readings. Its weight was on both legs evenly. The head was tilted maybe 10 degrees off vertical, the way a dog tilts its head when it's processing a sound. The arms were absolutely still. The whole body was absolutely still. The only motion he could detect was the very slight rise and fall of the chest, which was breathing slowly. He counted the breaths. He got to 23 before the figure raised the arm. He told me he kept thinking during those 4 minutes about whether to speak. He'd read enough about first contact protocols, mostly for fun, mostly the SETI material, to know that the conventional wisdom was that you should signal intent verbally and clearly, even if you didn't expect to be understood, because the act of speaking communicated something the words didn't. He'd opened his mouth twice during the 4 minutes and closed it again both times. He told me the reason he hadn't spoken was that he didn't know what he would have said. Every sentence he tried out in his head sounded either insulting or insane. Hello felt like a category error. Who are you felt like a question that couldn't have an answer in any language he had access to. What do you want felt like a question that, if he asked it, he'd have to live with the answer too. So he stood and didn't speak and watched. He told me the strangest moment in the 4 minutes wasn't the figure raising its hand. The strangest moment was about halfway through, when the wind shifted very slightly and brought a different layer of the smell to him. The musk got cut briefly with something he could only describe as warmth. Warm earth, warm cloth, warm skin. The way a sleeping animal smells if you bend down to it. He told me that smell was the worst thing he'd experienced all day, because for 1 second it made the figure feel close. Not close in distance, close in category. as if whatever was standing at 60 yards was, on the level of the body, related to him in a way he hadn't been prepared for. Then the figure raised an arm, just one arm. It raised its right arm to about shoulder height, palm out. The fingers were long and clearly visible. The arm stayed up for about 10 seconds. Then it turned, walked 4 steps deeper into the trees, and was gone. Vale didn't move for another minute. Then he packed his gear and hiked. He hiked through the dark with a headlamp. He hiked through the night, not stopping, not eating, not drinking. He covered 14 miles between sundown and sunrise on rotten snow with a 50-pound pack. He told me he didn't know how he did it. He said his body just kept going. He got to his truck a little after 7 in the morning. He sat in the cab for an hour before he could get the key in the ignition. He drove to my house in Boise that Friday, and we sat in my kitchen and he told me everything. And then he asked me what I thought. I told him I didn't know. I told him the truth, which was that I'd read what he'd read, and I'd looked at his photographs, and I'd helped him build the pattern, and I still didn't have a framework for what he was describing. I told him the Enoch material gave me a category to put it in, but I wasn't sure the category was correct. I told him that whatever the thing was, the gesture, the raised hand, the way it stood and waited and then walked away, didn't read as predatory to me. He nodded. He said it didn't read as predatory to him either. It read as acknowledgement. He said that's what scared him the most. I asked him what he meant. He told me that an animal that wanted to kill him would have killed him. There was nothing stopping it. He was alone in the wilderness, 14 miles from his truck, in the cold, at dusk, with no weapon worth mentioning. The thing had been arranging stones on the ground in a deliberate pattern, with his trail camera component in the center of it, when he walked up. If it had wanted to hurt him, it had had every opportunity. It hadn't wanted to hurt him. It had wanted him to see the arrangement. It had wanted him to see itself. And it had raised its hand in something that, if you wanted to be charitable, you could call a greeting. The question was, why? What did it want him to understand? He told me he'd been thinking about it for the 4 days since, and the only answer he kept arriving at was that the thing had been showing him, over the course of 17 months of approach, that it knew about him. It knew where his camera was. It knew when he came to service it. It knew that he had been the one watching, and it had wanted him to know, in turn, that it had been watching back. The clearing with the stones, he said, was an answer to the camera. We put one out for it. It had put one out for us. I asked him what he was going to do. He told me he was going to leave it alone. He wasn't going to publish the photographs. He wasn't going to bring it up to the agency again. He wasn't going to go back to Echo 7. He was going to swap the camera at the next service window and remount it at a different position lower on the slope, away from the clearing, and he was going to never service that camera personally again. He was going to assign it to a junior biologist. He was going to forget about it. I asked him if he thought he could forget about it. He said no. He thought about it every day. He thought he probably always would. He left my house around 6 in the evening. He drove back to Salmon. I didn't hear from him again for almost 5 months. The next time I saw Vale was 3 weeks ago. He came down to Boise on a Saturday. He didn't text in advance. He showed up at my door around noon, holding a paper bag with sandwiches in it from a place near my house we used to go to. He looked thinner than I remembered. His hair was longer. He hadn't shaved in a few days. We sat in my kitchen. He gave me the sandwich. He asked if I'd kept the 11 photographs. I told him I had. He asked if I'd kept them in the original folder structure with the metadata intact. I told him I had. He asked if I'd shared them with anyone. I told him I hadn't. Then he told me he was leaving the agency. He'd put in his notice. He'd be done by the end of the month. He and his wife had bought a small property in eastern Oregon near the John Day River, away from the deep forest. He was going to do consulting work, stream surveys, fisheries assessments, that kind of thing. Nothing that required overnighting in remote terrain. I asked him what had happened. He told me that in late August, 3 months after our conversation in March, he'd been at the field office in Salmon when a card came in from Echo 7. The junior biologist he'd assigned to it had pulled it on a routine service trip. The junior had logged it and tagged it and was about to put it back in the archive when Vale asked, without explaining why, if he could review it himself. He took the card to his desk and clicked through. There were no figures on it. 3 months of routine wildlife. Elk, a black bear with 2 cubs, a coyote, the normal traffic for that drainage at that time of year, but the last frame on the card, taken about 30 hours before the junior had pulled it, showed something different. Not the figure, something the figure had left. The trail camera had been remounted at its original height and angle when Vale did the swap in May, on a different tree about 20 yards downhill from the original lodge pole. He'd selected the new location carefully. He'd told himself the new mount was a clean break. The frame from late August showed the camera's field of view at dawn. The ground in front of the lens, on the game trail, was bare dirt and pine needles. And in the center of the frame, in the dirt of the trail, someone had drawn a circle, 12 feet across. Vale couldn't measure it from the photograph, but he could see from the perspective and the foreground references that it was the same size as the one he'd seen in April. The circle was empty in the middle. Around its edge, evenly spaced, were 12 dark dots that he understood were the same 12 stones. In the center of the circle, in the dirt, was a single small object. The photograph wasn't high resolution enough to identify it definitely, but Vale had a guess. The original locking pin from the original mount, the one he'd left in the clearing 40 yards uphill, brought down here, placed in front of the new camera location, with a fresh circle around it. It had found the new camera. It had recreated the arrangement. It was telling him it knew he had moved the camera. Vale told me he sat there for a while, trying to think of any other explanation. Bear, other biologists playing a joke. Hiker, although there shouldn't have been hikers in that drainage. He went through every alternative he could think of and put each one against the photograph. None of them held. A bear doesn't space 12 stones at 12 clock position intervals around a circle and set a locking pin in the middle. A hiker doesn't carry a locking pin from a clearing 40 yards uphill of a removed camera site 5 months earlier and a half-mile away. The picture only made sense if the thing that had drawn the first circle had drawn the second one and had brought the pin with it, and had known the new camera location. Vale told me he closed his laptop. He sat at his desk for a few minutes. Then he walked into Marlene Ash's office and asked her to remove him from the Echo 7 monitoring assignment, the entire monitoring grid, and the carnivore project. She didn't ask why. She nodded and made the change in the database while he watched. He was reassigned to a fisheries project in southern Idaho. He worked it through September. He gave his notice on October 1st. He told me, at my kitchen table 3 weeks ago, that he understood now what the thing was trying to do. I asked him what. He didn't read it as a threat. The thing wasn't trying to claim territory or chase him off. The opposite, he said. It was trying to maintain contact. It had picked him somehow out of all the people who could have been monitoring those cameras. It had walked up to him over the course of 17 months. It had stood at the clearing and raised its hand. It had followed his camera to its new location and recreated the arrangement. It was trying to be known to him. He said he didn't know why. He said maybe it had been alone for a long time. Maybe the categories we use for what an intelligence wants don't apply to what it wanted. The only way he could continue with his life was to remove himself from a position where it could find him. He said he didn't know if it would work. He hoped it would. He told me he'd dreamed about the clearing every night for the past 6 months. In the dreams, it was always summer. The snow was gone. He was walking up to the camera, and the camera was on the ground, and the clearing 40 yards uphill was waiting for him, and the figure was standing in it, and he was walking into the circle, and it was holding out its hand. He wasn't sure, in the dream, whether he took the hand. He always woke up just before he found out. Before he left the diner, he did one more thing. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph. It was taken from the back porch of his farmhouse in eastern Oregon, the kind of porch photograph anyone might take. Wood railing in the foreground, a lawn that needed mowing, a line of cottonwoods along a slow brown river, maybe 150 yards out. Late afternoon light, the kind of picture you'd send your mother to show her you'd gotten settled in. In the cottonwoods, between two trunks, there was a figure. He didn't say anything. He just held the phone out and let me look at it. I zoomed in on the figure with my fingers the way you zoom in on anything on a phone, and the resolution held for a while before it pixelated. The proportions were exactly what he'd described from the Frank church. Tall, narrow, the head set the wrong way on the shoulders. It was standing between the trunks the way a person stands behind a tree when they want to see without being seen. Except it wasn't behind the tree. It was just standing there, looking toward the porch. I asked him when he took it. He said 3 weeks ago. He said he'd taken 8 more like it since. Different days, different times. Always the cottonwoods, always around 150 yards out. Never closer. He swiped through them for me. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the photographs go past. One was at dawn, the river fog still on the ground, the figure standing in the gap between the same 2 cottonwoods. One was at noon under flat overcast light, the figure further to the right by maybe 30 feet, but still inside that same band of trees. One was after sunset, almost too dark to see anything, but Vale had brightened the exposure in an editing app on his phone, and you could just make out the outline. They were all framed similarly. The porch railing in the foreground, the river beyond, the cottonwood line at 150 yards, the figure standing among the trunks. He told me he'd put a wildlife camera up on the porch after the 3rd photograph. A Reckonix, the same model he'd used at Echo 7. He'd aimed it at the cottonwoods and set it to fire on motion. The camera had triggered hundreds of times in the 4 weeks since he'd put it up. Deer, 2 coyotes, a great blue heron that worked the slough every morning. The camera had not, in any of those triggers, photographed the figure. He could stand on the porch at sunset with his phone and see the figure between the cottonwoods and lift his phone and take a clear photograph of it. And the Reconix 4 feet to his left aimed at the same spot on the same motion. Sensor would not fire. He told me he didn't know what to make of that. He'd thought about it for a long time. The conclusion he'd reached, tentatively, was that the figure understood the difference between a phone in his hand and a camera on a tripod. The phone was him looking. The Reconix was a machine he wasn't watching. The figure was willing to be seen by him. It wasn't willing to be recorded by anything else. He told me that distinction, if it was real, scared him more than anything else about the new pattern, because it meant the figure was making choices about what to be visible to, and that the choices were being made on the basis of attention. It was, in his phrasing, not avoiding cameras. It was avoiding witnesses other than him. I asked him if he was scared. He thought about that one for a while. Then he said no. He said it was the opposite of scared, which he wasn't sure was a good thing or a bad thing. He said it felt like a treaty. He said in the Frank church the figure had wanted to close the distance, and he hadn't known what it would do if it did, and that was what he'd run from. In eastern Oregon, the figure was just there, at 150 yards, the same 150 yards, every time. Not coming closer, not going away. He said he thought that was the arrangement. He said he thought he was allowed to live his life out as long as he didn't try to close the gap, and as long as the figure didn't either. He said the cottonwoods felt like the line that had been drawn for him to live behind, and he had decided, at 61 years old, to live behind it. I asked him if he ever thought about going down to the river. He said every day. We ate the sandwiches. He drove home that evening. He sent me a text the next morning that just said, "Thank you," and I haven't heard from him since. Look, I'm not going to tell you what to make of any of this. I have photographs in a folder on my laptop. I have a copy of the Book of Enoch with chapters 6 through 16 flagged. I have the GPS coordinates of a clearing in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho. I have a friend who used to be a careful, sober, deeply rational wildlife biologist, and who is now, by his own description, somebody who has retreated to the open country of eastern Oregon because he is afraid that something in the deep forest learned his face and has been trying, slowly and patiently, to introduce itself. What I think is this. The cryptid frame on this kind of story, the dogman frame, the Sasquatch frame, the whatever frame, doesn't really get at what Vale saw. Those frames want a creature that's hiding, that's running from people, that's evolutionarily distinct and trying not to be found. The thing in Vale's photographs wasn't hiding. It walked up to a camera over the course of a year and posed for it. It moved the camera and arranged stones for him to find. It raised its hand at him and walked away. That's not a hiding creature. That's something else. The Enoch frame gets closer. The spirits described in the Book of Enoch are not animals. They are intelligences. They take shapes. They dwell in wild places. They are, the text says, older than any human civilization. And they are interested in us. They have always been interested in us. They show up at the edges of our maps. I don't know if I believe in the Book of Enoch. I'm not equipped to make that call. What I do know is that Vale, who is a biologist, and who has spent his career not believing in things until the data forced him to, has come around to believing that something is in those forests that is not in any catalog and never will be. That has been in those forests since before catalogs existed. That has a posture and an attention and a patience, and that knows about us. Vale is in eastern Oregon now. He sends me photographs sometimes, river photographs mostly. The John Day at sunrise, a small farmhouse with the lights on. A bend in the river where he caught a small steelhead in November. He doesn't talk about the Frank Church. I open the folder once a week. I look at the 11 photographs. I close it. If you ever find yourself on a backcountry maintenance schedule for a wildlife monitoring grid, and you pull a card and notice a tall figure at the edge of a frame, my advice is to file it as a malfunction. Move the camera. Don't try to understand it. Don't go in alone. And don't expect that the thing won't follow. It's been there longer than you. It will be there longer than you. The only thing you can do is decline its invitation. That's what Vale did. As far as I can tell, it worked. He's still in eastern Oregon. He's still answering my texts. I keep thinking about the dream, though. The hand held out across the circle. The question of whether he took it or not. Some questions you don't get to answer for somebody else. Some questions you only get to answer for yourself.